Well, obviously, Mr. Erdogan is the key person behind this. The troops that have been trained and well organized, even though they are very hostile towards one another, many of these different groups, they've been at war with each other in Idlib, in occupied Idlib. And the Turkish government has always been trying to keep the peace and keep them coordinated. But they succeeded in organizing them as a single fighting force, the different Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliates, and also elements of ISIS. And the timing was perfect for him, and it was perfect for Netanyahu, because when Netanyahu spoke about needing a ceasefire to deal with the so-called Iranian threat, that's what he meant. Because when Iran strikes the Israeli regime, and it will strike, it will have nothing to do with Hezbollah. It will have nothing to do with the battles on the ground. It will be missiles that will be fired towards Israel. So it can't be to protect the Israeli regime against incoming missiles. So obviously, the Iranian threat, the so-called Iranian threat, has to be dealt with on the ground, and if it's not Lebanon, then obviously it's Syria. So that's one issue. The second is that the Israelis have been threatening the Syrian government recently, and very seriously. They've been making very serious threats. So literally the day after the ceasefire, and it is a shaky ceasefire, and that is also significant, because on the one hand, Hezbollah is looking to its back, and on the other hand, the Israelis are constantly violating the ceasefire. This attack came literally a day after, and therefore it suits Netanyahu's purposes. And I think it's very clear that Erdogan and Netanyahu are very much in coordination, and it fits the pattern. Netanyahu, after 14 months, he continues to transport very inexpensive oil to Israel from Baku and Central Asia. If Erdogan wanted it to stop, he could have told Aliyev to end it, because some in the Turkish government say it's not in our hands, which is of course nonsense. But in any case, Erdogan has that influence over Aliyev that that could have brought it to a halt. Also, after the ICC ruling, Erdogan could have said, well, we have the ICC has declared Netanyahu as a war criminal who has to be apprehended, and that could have been a legal excuse to stop the flow. But it was obvious that he never planned to stop selling oil, and trade continues directly and indirectly. Diplomatic ties exist. Intelligence officials travel back and forth. So Netanyahu and Erdogan have never really had any serious problem. If you recall, when the Israelis were threatening to invade Lebanon, Erdogan said that if they attack Lebanon, we'll send in troops. Not only did they not do anything about it, but they sent in troops to stab Hezbollah in the back. So I think that Erdogan wants a piece of the cake, and he wants to be in the good books of Trump and Netanyahu. And Netanyahu needs to break Syria in order to surround Hezbollah and be able to fight Hezbollah in a much stronger position under those circumstances. If Hezbollah is surrounded and the Israeli regime attacks again, then it will be much more difficult than now, because Syria is key, not only in supporting Hezbollah, but Palestinian groups in Syria, in Lebanon, but also elsewhere in the West Bank and even in Gaza.
Let's talk about 2020, because it's so important in what's going on in Syria. There was an agreement between the government in Syria and these Takfiri groups that they had some sort of ceasefire agreement. And on the other hand, we had an agreement between Iran, Russia, and Turkey about the militarized zone, talking about Aleppo and Idlib. What has happened to those agreements?
Well, they've fallen apart. The Turkish government undermined the agreement, and Iran was skeptical from the beginning. It was the Russians, to be very blunt, that were more keen on this equation. The Iranians believed that ultimately Mr. Erdogan would violate the deal because Erdogan has a history of violating agreements. And he's constantly tilting. One day he's tilting towards the east, the next day he's tilting towards the west. You know, some people think that that is very smart of him. The fact that he's always constantly playing people off against one another or countries off against one another. But what it does in the long run is that it creates a huge mistrust. And so he caused Iran to completely distrust him. The Russians, due to a host of different reasons, they were perhaps less skeptical, but also they had their own issues that they wanted to deal with. And therefore, they took a different approach. But I think what Erdogan did in Syria has really changed things. The Russians are very angry. And the Iranians, of course, are very angry as well. But there is a very different mood today than when Erdogan first began building up ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. And that is that the regional mood has changed. As we've seen, the Arab League is not on his side. They've condemned what he's done. The Chinese, the Russians, of course, and other major players, they have condemned this. The Europeans don't seem to be all that enthusiastic, and even the Americans are having a hard time justifying it. So even Qatar, the language that you see on Al Jazeera, Arabic and English, is different from what it was in 2011, 12, 13, and so on. So this has put Mr. Erdogan in a very difficult position. And the very fact that initially he, through those who carry out his propaganda, they were trying to say that this was just a limited operation, but that was obviously not the case. That the numbers of fighters were huge. After the advances, they brought in more troops. They expanded the front. It was obviously never intended to be a limited operation. It was intended to bring down the Syrian government. Hezbollah had withdrawn into Syria, not because it used its forces on the battlefield. Most of Hezbollah forces never got close to the battlefield, but they were prepared for war. So the focus was on the Israeli regime in case it was, they were needed there. Otherwise, only a fraction of Hezbollah's forces were ever used on the battlefield, a very small segment of them. Yet, right before the attack happened, the Israelis bombed all the border crossings, thus slowing down the return of Hezbollah troops. It was obvious that this was the Israelis. They bombed those border crossings so Hezbollah couldn't go back into Syria quickly, and then that coincided with the offensive. The coordination between Erdogan and Netanyahu was clear as day. But it went badly for Erdogan, both politically, now militarily, because the Russians are all in, the Iranians are all in, and the Syrian armed forces have regained they've reorganized, regrouped, and they will begin pushing back. And of course, more troops will be coming in, more support will be coming in, and time is not on his side. So he's both politically isolated, but also militarily. The terrorists are not going to have an easy time dealing with these combined forces.
Are Iranians helping the Assad government and its military to organize? Because it seems that they were not prepared for this type of attack. And yesterday I've learned from one. Yeah. Go ahead, Professor مرندي.
Yes, well, the Iranians and the Russians, have been based in different places. So, for example, one of the places that the Iranians have been focused on was in near Deir ez-Zor, near the border with Iraq, where the Americans are, they're trying to close that border to isolate Syria. So the Iranians and their allied forces have been focused there, and some forces have been focused on near the Golan, the Syrian-occupied Golan, in case the Israeli regime were to attack Syria or to attack Syria to get into Lebanon. So only one Iranian person was martyred during the operation. That was a general. He was assassinated by a drone. There is speculation that that was an Israeli drone, but I haven't followed up on that. But at the time when I was informed, the belief was that it was an Israeli drone. And of course, if that was the case, then that is a further evidence of coordination between the Israeli regime and Netanyahu. But if it was a drone by the terrorists, that means that Turkey indirectly murdered an Iranian general. But a significant number of Russians were killed, and because they were in that area. But there are significant numbers of Iranians who've gone to Syria. Those numbers will probably increase. Iranian advisors in large numbers. If necessary, Iranian troops will enter the fray as well. But right now, a large number of Iranian advisors, from my understanding, have entered. And so of Iraqis affiliated with the resistance, and in large numbers. And I think probably other groups that work under the Iranian command. So the numbers are increasing, but they've already increased as we speak. They are working to push back these terror groups. But the Syrian army has regrouped. That is an important point. There have been some very heavy. Right now, as we speak, there's very heavy fighting going on, both in multiple fronts. And the Syrians have gained some land territory today, but I think this is going to take a while for things to get back to normal. Personally, I think that there will be a lot of discussions going on between the Iranians and the Russians, but I think that the Iranians will be insisting that the whole issue of Idlib has to be resolved once and for all.
Yeah, one of the reasons that Iran couldn't solve the issue of Idlib, as you've mentioned, was the Russians were not so keen about solving the situation. They wanted to have some sort of common ground between Iran and Turkey. Was that the case during those days?
Yes, Iran also wants common ground with Turkey as well, and so do the Russians. But the Iranians felt that this is going to be a problem, and that it's not going to end well. And the Russians possibly felt the same. I don't know, but they were pushing for some sort of agreement. That agreement was achieved, but we are where we are now. But yes, the Russians, I think, especially after Ukraine, they felt the need to quiet other fronts. But this happened before the war in Ukraine, this agreement. So, but still, Russia wanted good relations with Turkey. Again, Iran wants very good relations with Turkey. Even during the height of the fighting, Iran and Turkey cooperated in other areas. But this particular chapter, what Mr. Erdogan did this time around, was particularly shocking for everyone, because the war in Gaza was going on. Hezbollah was making enormous sacrifices for the people of Gaza. The sacrifices that Lebanon has made are huge. And the Syrians have made huge sacrifices. They've been bombed regularly by the Israelis, and it doesn't even get into the Western media. They don't even talk about it. But they've been constantly slaughtering Syrians. They actually, a few months ago, I was in Syria, and I was invited to the Cuban ambassador's residence, the residence of his. And I've been told that that building was destroyed in one of the more recent bombings. There was an airstrike where I think 15 people were killed. I think the ambassador wasn't there. But the point is that the destruction in Damascus is so extensive that even I, with my limited experience of Damascus, know places which have been destroyed. So the Syrians have been making huge sacrifices for Gaza, for Lebanon, and then being stabbed in the back like that, I think is quite stunning.
Yesterday, I've learned from one of our guests, Dr. Gilbert Doctorow. He said that Erdogan called Putin, but Putin didn't answer his phone. Do you think that Russia is feeling, because we had some sort of the same type of situation before? If you remember, we had Ukrainian prisoners in the hand of Russians, which were handed over to Turkey, and then Turkey gave them to, it's, they're doing the same right now. Do you think at the end of the day, Russia is getting to the point that totally understands what would be the motive of Erdogan? And because they have to, if they want to talk with Turkey again, we had the foreign minister of Iran going to Syria, then to Turkey, and we've learned that the president of Iran talked with Putin. They're going to meet in the near future. But at the end of the day, if you want to talk with Erdogan and his government and his administration, you have to understand their attitude. They're not going to change it. They're just repeating what they have been doing all this for many years. But right now, as you've mentioned, the situation is totally different, because we have Palestinians, and Donald Trump is coming to the office and he's just sending vicious messages to Palestinians, and we're gonna, you have to release the hostages, or we're gonna just smash you, all of you, destroy all of you. And you see Erdogan doing this. How do you see what's going on in the mind of the administration in Iran and in Russia, and how they can deal with Erdogan?
I'd just like to add that, Palestinians in the West Bank right now, I think they have, from the men and women and children among them, I think maybe 12,000, maybe your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. I think they have 12,000 hostages in Israeli prisoners, and I think more than half of them, 2/3 of them, they have never been charged. And they have children in prison. And why are they hostages? Because they're from the occupied West Bank. The West Bank is illegally occupied by the Israeli regime. And this is not including the hostages that have been taken from Gaza. So literally you have tens of thousands of Palestinian hostages. But Trump or Western none of the Western leaders, they care. None of them care about it at all. And these hostages go back well before October the 7th. The reason why October the 7th happened was that they wanted to take Israeli prisoners, and a lot of them were soldiers, and a lot of them who were, even those who were in the party alongside the apartheid wall, they were young adults. They were all reservists or soldiers. It's not as if they were like children dancing at 5 a.m. over there. They were all adults. So, but in any case, even the reason why they took them hostage or prisoner was because they wanted their prisoners and hostages to be released. People who've been in jail, women in jail who've been sexually abused, children who've been in jail who've been sexually abused, and men as well. They wanted these people released. That's what this was about. But in any case, that aside, I think that the relationship with Mr. Erdogan has evolved significantly. And, I should also add that when Erdogan gave those prisoners that he promised not to hand them over. He promised not to hand them over to Ukraine. They were Azov battalion prisoners. They were fascists. They were Nazis. And Nazis for the Russians are like ISIS for Iranians, because of the Second World War and the mass slaughter of Slavs. The biggest victim of the Nazis, the number one victims of the Nazis were the Slavs, were the Russians by far, more than Jews or Gypsies or anyone else. But of course, since they're Russian, the West doesn't say anything about it. Just like the Chinese, who were huge victims during the Second World War, and they had, after the Russians, or maybe alongside the Russians, they had the largest number of people slaughtered by the Japanese occupation. And of course, the Japanese occupation, that is also a long story, and how the Americans really pushed for this war. But in any case, these Azov battalion people, which were handed over, were, I think, exposed the nature of Mr. Erdogan, that he's not a person who keeps promises. But what happened this time round was much worse, because they tried to destroy the whole of Syria. They killed Russians in the process. And this was not about a few soldiers. This was about an entire country. And Turkey wanted to humiliate Russia, as well as Iran, I'm sure, by just taking the country with, through some sort of blitzkrieg attack. But I think, well, Erdogan, not Turkey. Turks are among the most steadfast supporters of the Palestinian people. And we've seen many protests against Erdogan by Turks who've been protesting against trade, who've been protesting against his relations with the Israeli regime, who've been protesting against the export of oil. And a lot of Turks have boycotted all Western products and shops and Starbucks and McDonald's. So ordinary Turks in Turkey, are a bit, different. They have a completely different attitude than that of Erdogan. But in any case, he's shown himself to be completely untrustworthy. And I think in the future, the Iranians and the Russians will never treat him seriously again. And even if they have another agreement with him, they're not going to believe that he's going to abide by it, because that's just not what he does.
In your opinion, there are two different concepts of the main reason of this attack on the part of Erdogan, and maybe Israelis are behind this. And they have, we're sure that they have connection with these people. But do you think that how much of what's going on right now is in Syria is related to the conflict in Ukraine? Because we've learned that the drones that are using right now in Syria are Turkish drones made in Ukraine. And how much of what's going on is related to the conflict in Ukraine, and how much, and the other side would be how influential that would be for the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel? Because we know Israel has a lot of interest in disconnecting Iran from Hezbollah.
Well, these are two questions, so I'll deal with them separately. The Ukraine is very much linked to Syria, and that is another betrayal, because all of the equipment, all of the weapons, all of the vehicles, everything that goes into Idlib goes through the Turkish border. So they are the ones who are in charge. Ukrainian trainers, Ukrainian weapons, whatever assistance that Ukraine gives is done with the consent of Mr. Erdogan. Countries in the Persian Gulf, if they are giving funding, which they do, some certain countries, it's done through Mr. Erdogan. So he is definitely in charge of all of this. But without a doubt, the Ukrainians are trying very hard to get revenge on Russia through Syria. But I think they've miscalculated in a big way. Because, first of all, the Iranians and their troops, their allies that are in Syria, that will increase in number in Syria too, they will be doing a lot of the work on the ground. But the Russians' major focus will be in the air, even though they are bringing in troops. But their focus is on the air. The Air Force, the Russian Air Force has not been used extensively in Ukraine. And therefore, the Russians have no shortage of pilots and planes and ammunition to drop on targets in these occupied territories. So now that they failed to take Damascus and Hama and so on, although they've taken a huge segment of the country, they are going to be very vulnerable, especially because they're spread out and a lot of the terrain is flat and very good for jets to find targets. And of course, there's the Syrian Air Force as well. So the Russians are not going to have to bring in a lot of troops from the war fronts in Ukraine. It's not going to have that sort of impact. Personally, I think that Netanyahu made a mistake. And there's no doubt that the real person behind this is Netanyahu. And Erdogan is working with Netanyahu, but the timing serves Netanyahu's purpose first and foremost. No doubt about it. And Erdogan was very foolish to do it now. He could have waited at least a couple of months if it was for his own personal ambitions. But he didn't, because the Israelis needed it now. But what we're seeing effectively is that the Iranian troops and the Russian troops, but more importantly the Iranian troops, are going to be back in Syria for a long time. And that is not good news for Netanyahu. And Netanyahu knows that he cannot touch the Iranians, because if he does, the Iranians will hit him back. And the Iranians are going to hit him back. The Iranian strike is coming, but it could happen next week. It could happen. I'm pretty sure it will happen before Trump comes to power, although it's just a personal belief. I don't have any inside information. But Netanyahu knows that he cannot strike Iranians anymore, because that'll just give Iran an opportunity to strike at Israel. And that's, Iran would like to have that excuse. It doesn't want to have its soldiers hurt, but it wants to have an excuse to punish the Israeli regime for a host of reasons. But I think it was a major miscalculation on behalf of Netanyahu, because they failed to overthrow the Syrian government. They did a very good job in psychological warfare during the first 3-4 days. But things were never really as bad as they were saying, although they were making progress. But now that the lines have held and support is coming in, and the extremists, the terrorists are giving huge casualties, although the Syrian government has lost quite a few men, but the extremists their casualties are far higher. Now that the tide is beginning to turn, I think it's clear that both Netanyahu and Erdogan both made major miscalculations.
How about, is there going to be any sort of meeting between Erdogan together with Iran and Russia, or they're not considering any sort of these type of talks?
I don't think that in the short term we're going to see such a thing, because this was big. Russians have been murdered. And this was a major betrayal, and especially to the Russians, because the Russians were the ones who were trying to convince the Iranians to accept, the sort of stalemate or a sort of agreement over Edna. The Iranians were not happy. The Iranians back then I was in Syria at that time when eastern Aleppo was liberated. I was in Western Aleppo. I was actually on campus. It was interesting. Western Aleppo was held by government forces. Eastern Aleppo was held by Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. When they took Aleppo, back then. These extremists, these terrorists, were on the back foot. They were losing. They were retreating on all fronts. But Turkey, the Russians didn't want Erdogan to be humiliated. The Iranians, of course, didn't want to see Erdogan humiliated, but they also felt that this had to come to an end. But now that it's come to this point, I think the Russians are probably more angry than the Iranians, although this is just sheer speculation on my behalf. But I think the sense of betrayal among Russians is even greater than that of the Iranians, because I think the Iranians were expecting it.
And the other question would be, right now, if they go to...
And by the way, may I just add one thing? And that is that some say that the advances that were made, they were much more, they were unexpected, and that these groups really didn't want to go so far. The evidence doesn't show that. When they made those advances, there were new waves coming in, wave after wave. It was obviously intended to go very far. And Erdogan, he holds the leash. He could have pulled them back at any time or told them not to go any further at some point or another, but that never happened. As I said, even there's heavy fighting now, but very heavy fighting is going on. But about 24 hours ago, there was really tough fighting in Hama. They were trying to move into the city. They failed, and they had to retreat. But the point is that this is no limited operation, and Mr. Erdogan has not pulled anyone back from any of their positions. In fact, it's been the opposite.
If you look at the motives behind this action, behind this type of mindset on the part of Erdogan, do you think that he's willing to overthrow the government in Syria, or as one of the nationalist member, if I'm not mistaken, Turkish parliament, he said that Aleppo is part of Turkey and it's going to get back to Turkey. Is that related to those cities, Idlib, Aleppo, or they want to overthrow the government in Syria? And what would be the benefit for them? It's all about refugees in Turkey or something else?
I think it's both. I think they wanted to overthrow President Assad, but also I think the Turkish government wanted a very strong sphere of influence in northern Syria and in northern Iraq. They have the same ambitions in northern Iraq, and they would like to see their sphere of influence. In fact, President Erdogan said that just a few days ago, that they want to create a buffer zone across the south of Turkey all the way to Iran. So, all of these things, when you put them together, it's clear as day what was going on. But he would like a sphere of influence, and then that ultimately, I would imagine that over time, over years, it would become a part of Turkey. But that's just not possible. I'm very surprised that he carried out this operation, because people have been speaking about Erdogan's hypocrisy since October the 7th. But carrying out this operation at this moment, is clear that this was done in coordination with the Israelis. And this really destroyed President Erdogan's image, except for those really hardcore people who, no matter what he does, they're going to back him. And no matter what the resistance does, they're going to hate the resistance. It doesn't matter what the axis of resistance does or doesn't do. So I have no doubt that he would like to have parts of Syria to be a part of Turkey ultimately over time, and to have a sphere of influence across Syria, and a broken and fragmented Syria is something that the Israeli regime wants as well. It works very well for him and for Netanyahu. But again, the problem is that the world has changed. The Russians today are far more assertive. The Iranians are far more assertive. The axis of resistance is far more assertive. Israel is despised. And so Erdogan's policies over the last year have not gone unnoticed. In the past, he just ranted about Israel and people, loved it, or many in Turkey loved it. He didn't have to do anything. He'd give some Palestinians visas and scholarships to study, and he'd gain popularity that way. He opened offices so that Hamas leaders could stay there or their families could stay there. That gave him credibility without paying a price. He didn't give Gaza anything. He didn't provide them with weapons, or he didn't help fund the tunnels. The Iranians paid billions of dollars for these defense capabilities. He never did any of that, but he got the popularity. The Iranians didn't get the popularity because no one knew what Iran was doing back then. Now they know, but he was benefiting. But now in the last year, I think that's all gone away, except for the most hardcore supporters, as I said earlier. His support base has fractured, and now you do see across the Arab world governments and ordinary people criticizing him, attacking him for these policies. It's a different situation. He made a catastrophic mistake. I think also Netanyahu made a major mistake because, as I said, these Iranian troops are not going to go away anytime soon.
The question is, if he wants to overthrow the government in Syria, who's going to replace the government? These takfiris, these people, these extremists that are just killing each and everybody in that region? Because at the end of the day, if let's assume it's in his mind, but what would happen to Lebanon? What would happen to Gaza? It's not, it's all connected. If these people we know that these takfirs are directly connected with Israel, they talk with it, they would do everything in favor of Israel. And what's going on in that direction in the mind of
But that's exactly what the situation was like in Idlib. In Idlib, these different groups have constantly been killing each other. Even during these last few days, in Aleppo, there was heavy fighting between two of the different factions. And there have been significant casualties in clashes between the different groups who were fighting over territory gained, or over booty, or over assets that they captured. These groups hate each other, and they were at each other's throats in Idlib over the last 4 or 5 years. But that was fine for Mr. Erdogan. As long as they served his purpose, and that would be the future of Syria. Certain areas he may take for himself, and then other areas, if they're broken and fragmented, that keep Syria weak, or what's left of Syria weak, that serves Netanyahu's purpose, that serves the Israeli regime's purpose, that serves Erdogan's purpose. So what if people are at each other's throats? So what if people are killing each other in these no-man lands? What they don't want is a strong Syria. What they don't want is a Syria that can protect its borders, that can field soldiers on the border with the Israeli regime. That's what the Israelis don't want. That's what Erdogan doesn't want, and both of them succeeded in doing so. It's quite stunning, the amount of damage that Erdogan has done to the economy of Turkey as well. Not only do we have huge numbers of refugees, but also the trade that has been lost between Turkey and Syria is huge. Erdogan used to go on family vacation with President Assad and the two wives were part of it. But he was benefiting. Of course, economically, Turkey benefited at the beginning in 2012 and 13 because all the factories were being stolen and taken to Turkey. The Syria, the areas controlled by these Takfiri groups, they were being plundered. And I went to, for example, the industrial park in East Aleppo during the period when East Aleppo had just been liberated, and we stayed there a couple of nights. The factory was all the factories were gone. There was nothing left. Everything had been taken and sold in Turkey. So the industrial base of northern Syria simply was, disappeared. It was taken away. But after that, the absence of trade, the absence of business, and then the sanctions, the Caesar sanctions, which are really barbaric, the sanctions imposed on Syrians, it's destroyed what's left of the economy. But in any case, because of all this, Turkey has lost many billions of dollars. And again, as I said, the sheer amount of refugees and the tensions that they've caused, unfortunately, they're victims of Erdogan's policies. But in any case, the tensions that have been caused as a result of those refugees are an issue, is a big issue in Turkey as well. So he wanted to become a man of great influence, to, reestablish the Ottoman Empire of sorts. But what he did was he destroyed the positive legacy that he had for his first decade in power, where he did do good work for the country, and then he turned into something very different from the Netanyahu, from the Erdogan of the first decade, and his policies became sinister, and his attitudes became, they changed completely. He seems like a very different person from the person who was in charge during the first decade. Very cynical.
Pardon me. Many people are trying to diminish the picture to a fight between Turkey and Iran, because what they're arguing is that Iran has some sort of influence on all of these countries, and Turkey wants to break that chain of resistance that exists. But at the end of the day, we know what Iran does, and what's happening between Iran and Israel is because of Gaza, because of Palestine. It's not it's because of what has happened in southern Lebanon. All these people are under the thumb of Israel because they're trying to do everything to these people. But Erdogan, here comes the question. I don't understand the behavior of Erdogan. Do you think that in his mind and his administration, do they really believe that if Iran goes weaker and these people being defeated in that region, that would benefit Turkey?
Well, first of all, I think Erdogan went to Lebanon after the flotilla incident, where a number of Turks were martyred in the Mediterranean by the Israeli regime. I think there were 10. And when he went to Lebanon, Hezbollah treated him as a hero. They were, flags all over the place, and people were welcoming him. Hezbollah was behind most of it. Back then, they viewed him very differently. And Iran wanted Turkey to be a part of this axis of resistance. And Iran was pushing Turkey to make the right decisions, to cut off oil, to break off ties, to break off trade. If they'd done that, the situation in Israel would have been very different. And it would have put pressure on other countries to do something. But since Turkey didn't do it, no one else did. Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, the Emirates, Morocco, they all preserved their ties and businesses. Turkey made some small steps when it came to business, but not really what Erdogan pretended that he had done. So if he had helped the resistance would have welcomed him. They would have, I think, if he had joined, the situation today would have been very different. But maybe once upon a time he did have certain ideals, but after 2011 that changed. I remember this young reporter, Serena Sheen. She worked for Press TV, and she was alongside the Turkish-Syrian border when there was heavy fighting I think it was in Ain al-Arab or Kobani, if I'm not mistaken. And she reported that World Food Organization trucks were being used to take in weapons and troops for ISIS into Turkey. And then Turkish intelligence said that she was a spy, and she reported that. It's people can find it online. It's on YouTube and elsewhere. And she said, "I'm very worried, and I haven't done anything. I've just been reporting facts." And hours later, she was killed in a car accident as she was leaving the border area. And now there's an award in her name, Suri Nashim. She was a Lebanese American with 2 kids. I think, after that, it was becoming increasingly clear that the sort of sinister role that Turkish intelligence was playing and the Turkish military, at the behest of Erdogan, of course, in Syria. And I think that, from then onwards, this was a very different Turkey. This is not the Turkey of Najmuddin Erbakan. If he was in power, I think that Israel would be in a much tougher situation. He was a very principled person. Of course, I know what I'm saying is not going to please some of my some of your Turkish viewers, but as I said, Erbakan was very different from Erdogan, and the policies that we've been seeing pursued since 2012, at least, even though since 2011, that's when the American operation began. And when Obama signed off this operation, where was this operation being implemented? Where were they carrying out from? It was being done from Istanbul and from Jordan. And I don't want to name names, but a person who was involved in Afghanistan during the Afghanistan, that person was in Pakistan during the 1980s. And he was involved in what was going on in Afghanistan. And that person in late 2011 and early 2012 told me, I was in Beirut at that time, I was on sabbatical. He told me that this is a dirty war. And I said, how do you know? He said, because all the people who I knew in Pakistan are now in Istanbul. So it was clear what was going on. It's not as if he didn't know back then. So this is basically an extension of that. But the painful thing about what he just did was that it was while the resistance was actually giving huge sacrifices for the sake of Gaza to save lives. Hezbollah has paid a heavy price. The people of Lebanon have paid a heavy price for this victory. It wasn't an absolute victory. But if Turkey had helped, Hezbollah's victory would have been absolute. But instead, not only did they not help, but ultimately they stabbed the resistance in the back. I mean, Erdogan did, not Turkey.
Do you think that Turkey, that Turkey wanted to be part of BRICS? How is that going to affect their request and to be part of BRICS? And do you think, because many people, when you look at the picture in Ukraine and in the Middle East, we are seeing that the East and the West are fighting each other. And Turkey, it seems that they want to play both sides. And they're part of NATO. They want to be part of BRICS. But right now, do you think that the situation that's happening right now would influence the decision of the Russian on Turkey being part of BRICS?
And Iran. But well, first of all, I want to make the distinction. I want to make sure that I'm making a distinction between Turkey or Turkiye and Erdogan, because again, I stress, the Turkish public is very much supportive of the Palestinian people. They had huge rallies. They've had effective boycotts, and they continue to boycott. And even now, people are protesting against Erdogan, his the oil sales, the diplomatic ties, the business ties, and they go to jail. They're going to jail. Some are in jail right now because of their protests. And so, if I say Turkey, I mean Erdogan, and if I say Erdogan, I mean Erdogan. But I think it will be much more difficult, and we'll have to see what happens a year down the road, because at the end of the day, Turkey is not Erdogan, and Iran would like to see Turkey inside BRICS, and so would Russia. They want Turkey to be on this side. But because of Erdogan, I think that raises serious questions, because he could join BRICS and then, undermine BRICS, to gain something from Trump. He's not someone that can be trusted anymore. So I think that there would be serious doubts as to whether he would be allowed into BRICS at this point. Of course, BRICS is an ongoing project. It's not an organization that's achieved what its ideals yet. It's moving in that direction. It is an important organization, but it will take time to reach the sort of so many people are very idealistic about BRICS, and they were hoping that in Kazan something wonderful would happen. I think they were being more than a bit too optimistic. But in any case, it's an important, very, very important organization. I don't want to diminish that at all. It's a very important organization. It will become more important. But as long as Erdogan's in power, I think that's going to impact many things.
Yeah. The other issue right now is the situation between Hezbollah or Lebanon and Israel. Do you think that this temporary ceasefire is going to last, and how long is it going? Because right now yesterday we learned that 52 attacks from Israel on Lebanon, on southern Lebanon. And what does it mean at the end of the day? If that's a ceasefire, what they're attacking Lebanon, and how? Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
Well, in 2006, we did have a similar situation. After the ceasefire, or a cessation of hostilities, or whatever it is that we should call it, the Israeli regime violated the ceasefire or cessation of hostilities repeatedly. This time around, they've done the same. I think they've killed more people than last time. I think so far, at least until yesterday, they murdered 19 people, ordinary people. In one instance, they murdered 9 people. And the Western media, again, Western governments, Western diplomats, they don't care. And even though they're based in Lebanon, again, this is, as I said once before on your show, this is not Gaza where they can pretend that they don't have verified information. In Beirut, all the major Western media outlets have a presence. Western embassies are there, and they know exactly what's going on, but they play this down. Interestingly, CNN did a report where they did admit that the Israelis were violating the truce, although they, from what I saw, they said nothing about the large number of deaths. 19 people being killed during a ceasefire is no small number. And Lebanon is not a huge country. So, but why wouldn't they? I mean, when Netanyahu is a genocidal monster, but also when Syria is being undermined by Erdogan, why wouldn't Netanyahu try to keep Hezbollah focused to the south, so that Hezbollah would not be able to help hold back ISIS and Al Qaeda? Why wouldn't they do? I mean, I assume that would be exactly what he would want to do. He would want to constantly violate the ceasefire so that Hezbollah would be focused on the south, and to distract them away from Syria, while Erdogan's foot soldiers would be, causing chaos in that country. So I think that's part of it, but also it's just, you know, a sinister Israeli regime. Their people are genocidal. They support genocide. People who've gone to Palestine during the last year have every single person who I've seen who's gone to Palestine over the last year that I've seen speak out about their experiences have said these people are genocidal. Everyone. A couple more recently, not to me, but I've seen them speak about it online. They're genocidal. They support the genocide. So these are people who, you know, they take pleasure in killing people. They take pleasure in bombing houses. They take pleasure at snipers taking out little kids and mothers and children. So why not kill some Lebanese? But again, I think that there's also a broader picture here, and that is that they want to keep Hezbollah focused to the south and prevent Hezbollah from being able to do more to help Syria.
I think you've mentioned Donald Trump's position and the way he's talking about Gazans, Palestinians, and he's asking to release hostages. He's asking Hamas to release hostages. And on the other hand, he's not asking Israelis to release the hostages in Israel. And we know what would be the outcome of these type of policies under Donald Trump administration. How the region is prepared for these type of policies, in your opinion? Because if they go with the annexation of the West Bank or maybe the northern Gaza, there has to be some sort of plan to go against it. Do you think that, I'm talking about Iran and the Arab states, is there any sort of understanding on how to deal with these type of policies?
Well, he's not asking. He's making very ugly threats. He's speaking like a genocidal monster himself, despite the fact that he presented himself as the peacemaker and the person who's against wars. You know, I don't think many of us believed it for a second, but many were hoping beyond hope that he would be different. Scott Ritter, very smart guy, very principled guy, very good guy. I think he was being naive, but not because he's a naive person, out of desperation, you know, hoping that someone will maybe do something. I understand that completely. I understand that position completely. Why he would maybe you know, under circumstances I would do the same thing. It's just, you know, the United States is like sinister. All sides are sinister. Both sides are controlled by the neocons, by the Zionists, by the warmongers. I mean, the Democrats, you know, Jake Sullivan, Zionist, supremacist, Blinken, the same. You can't get any worse than that. But, you know, Kushner talking about developing Gaza into resorts and taking the Palestinians into the desert. That's, you know, that's the United States. So I think that it's unclear what Trump is going to do, because Trump does say things that, you know, don't necessarily make sense. He says things that he doesn't do. And he's constantly shifting his position. He's influenced by people. He makes sudden decisions. It's difficult to say what he will do, but one thing that I can say for sure is that the world has changed a lot in the last 8 years, and especially during the last 3 years. The world has changed a lot. The United States is much weaker today than it was when Trump came to power. And rivals of the United States, or non-Western powers, let's say, because the United States sees everyone as a rival. Everyone else just wants to live their lives. The Iranians don't have any inherent animosity towards the United States, but, you know, the Americans won't get off our back. But rivals or countries in the global south or the global majority or whatever one would like to call it, they've been on the rise. China today is not the China of 8 years ago. Russia today is not the Russia of 8 years ago. Iran today is definitely not the Iran of 8 years ago. And we even see the shift over Syria as reflecting that. When the dirty war in Syria started, Syria was expelled from the Arab League. Now the Arab League is fully supporting Syria. Why? Why that change? It's in the Israeli interest to undermine Syria. It's what the Americans also want. It's what NATO also wants. But the Arab League doesn't see it that way. The world is changing. I'm not saying the Arab League countries, the majority still aren't in the US camp, but it's more complicated than before. The United States is not the power that it was before. And public opinion in our region has shifted. People are outraged. The mood has shifted. People don't see what's going on in Syria as many thought it was a decade ago. They're more politically aware. They see that this is, hypocrisy. They see that this is a stab in the back. They see that these extremist groups, they're not about Palestine. They see that Erdogan is not at all thinking about Palestine. He's thinking about Erdogan. So the mood has changed. The world has changed. The balance of power has shifted. Trump does not have the tools at his disposal that he had 8 years ago, and he promised his own supporters that he's going to stop the wars. And then, so if he comes and begins a war on day one when he comes to power, how is that going to be seen? And then his opponents, they're out to get him. The hatred for Trump today among his opponents, I think, is greater than 4 or 8 years ago. The animosity is huge. They'll use any excuse to go after him. So he may do stupid things, but it's going to be much more difficult for the United States, both internationally and internally, especially because Trump is such a divisive person, both internationally and internally.
Just to wrap up this session, one of the other comments on the part of Trump was that he was trying to threaten countries that don't want to use US dollar for their trades. Do you think at the same time he was just trying to intimidate them by putting more sanctions, more tariffs on them? How you can put these two pictures together? You want them to use dollar, and on the other hand, you want to put sanctions on them. Which is the main reason for which they have decided to run away from dollar.
Yes, I don't think he really thought that through, like he just doesn't think through a lot of other things, and it's not clear if he's ever going to carry out these threats. That's the whole problem with Trump. Trump is sort of like Erdogan, someone who just don't know where he stands, where he's going to go. And I think that's hurtful for the United States, just as Erdogan hurts his presence as president of Turkey, hurts Turkey. During his first decade, it's very different, but now I think that's how it is. But Trump, yes, if he wants to impose tariffs, 100% tariffs on all these countries, it's going to cause huge inflation in the United States. And then he also wants to kick out all of the immigrants and illegal immigrants or the refugees or whatever you want to call them. That's going to increase inflation. So how is he going to deal with that? So I find it difficult to imagine that he'll really do that. But Trump is a person who makes these threats. But also, I think it's a sign of U.S. vulnerability. I don't know how fast BRICS is going to be able to bring about change. I was speaking to a very smart Chinese and young Chinese scholar today about the Chinese currency, and that there are many difficulties for BRICS and for the Chinese to expand alternatives to the U.S. dollar. There are many challenges, but I think the very fact that Trump says this is a sign of U.S. vulnerability, and it only creates a further incentive for countries to protect themselves. Because if you're constantly threatening people, then they look for protection. And if you threaten them more so that they don't seek protection, you're only creating further incentive for them to seek that protection even more intensely than before.